Hi, Jess. Thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Andy.
This, I feel like, has been a long time coming. Well, I've certainly been following you, and we've been, exchanging things on social media for what seems like a long time now. And we've had this podcast sort of penciled in for a while, and it's lovely to be able to finally sit down. And I'm really excited because you've done an amazing case study for us that our members of the roadmap can go and check out. It is a beautiful project, and the numbers themselves are just incredible. So I'm very, very excited to get into some of the weeds of that today. And I think there's a lot of stuff that our listeners can take away. But before we get there, Jess, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're investing and what you're currently investing in?
Sure, thank you. Yes, hello. Thank you for having me. And I'm really glad that we could fit this podcast in between your wedding and travels. So I am Jess. My name is Jess Leader, and my company goes by the name of Next Level Living. And I've been investing in property since 2017 as a profession. And I first started doing that around my marketing career, which I was doing full time, and I left when I had my child 2 years ago. So I was sort of doing it part-time until then, and now I do it part-time around her. I work on HMOs, funnily enough, and flips, and I run those two strategies alongside each other. And at the time I started, I've always invested in the West Midlands. That's the area that I'm from, so I know parts of it really well. And when I started investing, I was living down in Brighton, but now I live back in the West Midlands, so it's just a little bit easier. Yeah, so that's me. I've got a portfolio of HMOs, and I've sold and bought some flips and HMOs along the way.
So you're a bit of a wheeler dealer with a soft spot for HMOs, which is what we like to. And actually, interestingly, a lot of people who've come on our show, and we've talked about their HMO projects, big part of their broader strategy has been other elements, and I find that really interesting. Talking to different people, there's often different reasons. And before we hit record today, you and I were just chatting a little bit about life and things in general, and we talked a little bit about the bits of work that you do outside of your property business. And I think it's useful, in some ways quite inspirational, beneficial for our listeners and people in our community to hear a little bit more about why we do certain things and why we choose not to do certain things. Because I think, certainly from personal experience, we often punish ourselves or feel like we should be doing other things in a different way, or doing more, or doing less. So this sort of strategy with flips alongside HMOs, can you talk to us a little bit about that, Jess? How does it work for you in practice? And is that an intentional decision? And is that something that you see as being an ongoing part of your sort of investment strategy?
Okay, so HMOs and flips was definitely very intentional. When I bought my first investment property, it was consciously always going to be an HMO, because I decided that my initial goal in property was to salary replace, like so many of us, and I didn't have the time the way that I wanted to do it to build up a buy-to-let portfolio. So I immediately went into HMOs. I had run a previous home as a buy-to-let for a couple of years that I hadn't lived in anymore, and it wasn't exciting to me, and the returns weren't worth it to me for what I was trying to do. So impatiently, I knew that HMOs was always going to be for me. I had sort of made money from a personal project in the past, and I really enjoyed that process, and I enjoyed the cash injection that came with it. So adding in flips to that just felt natural for the reason of I enjoyed the cash injections. I enjoy creating homes. I just love doing it. I love the creative process, and I love creating an end product that someone's going to enjoy. And it's a really good balance financially just to have, we know how much of a money sucker HMOs and developments can be. So having cash injections is something I'm never going to say no to. And it's just interesting to do more than one type of thing for me. So actually, final point on the flip side, we have often done them in our own names. So they've been a really tax efficient way for us to grow our pot to then reinject into the business. So it's kind of a blurred finance source of our money that we actually then put into our own residence and then grow it and then put it back into the business. So yeah, it's really helpful for that reason as well.
You can certainly hear that passion for what you do in property as you talk about it, which is lovely. And I think I share that as well. I just like to do deals, like to make nice things or create cool spaces. And I've done flips before, and I really enjoy that part. The bit that I don't quite like so much with the flips is the selling bit, and maybe I've just had a couple of bad experiences, and I just don't like that point at which everything's agreed, things are almost there, and then you're very much in the hands of buyers that might change their mind last minute or things go south, and that anxiety in that stage I don't quite like so much. I like to try and refinance stuff, but I'm totally with you, and I've done it myself and used flips to really sort of similar benefit. That capital injection is and can be so important. And I think for a lot of people, it almost sounds counterintuitive to have these dual strategies. But we've talked to a number of people on the show, Jake and Lucy from Innova. They're a really good example. And having that dual strategy actually, as counterintuitive as it can sound, you're spreading yourself a little bit more thinly, perhaps, or maybe not putting all of your resources into this one niche strategy, actually helps you replenish your capital, doesn't it? And what I find is it's very difficult to go into deals, particularly HMO deals, and I think more so now than perhaps any time in the last 5, 6, 7 years, to know exactly where you're going to come out of that deal and how much capital you might end up needing to leave in that deal, or you might be short to pay an investor back. And I think accruing a pot of capital that's yours and it's not entirely contingent, like your strategy is not entirely contingent on how that HMO deal goes, I think is becoming increasingly important. And I think done well, executed well, like you've obviously done, just makes it so much easier, makes you much more agile and maneuverable. And I'm hearing more people talk about this. I do have a question about flips though, Jess, and I've got to admit, I haven't flipped anything for a little while. How is that market at the minute, and with things the way they are? So obviously the market appears to be cooling off a little bit for various reasons. Is that advantageous for you, do you think, looking at those sorts of deals at the minute, maybe buying things slightly cheaper? Is it more of a risk or a concern, sort of trying to exit the deals? What's happening at the minute in the wider property market? How, if at all, is that changing what you're doing on that side of your strategy?
In a couple of ways. The last thing I bought was about 3 months ago, and that was a flip project. And with that, we made sure that we bought it at lower than the reserve. Actually, we bought it at auction for lower than the reserve. We bought it post auction, for lower than the reserve. So buying low is crucial because, as you say, you don't know where things are going to go. So you have to build so many more buffers in at every stage possible. Obviously, before you were trying to make money when you buy and trying to make sure you get the right price and building a contingency there. But I think that has to be stronger than ever now because no one's quite sure how much prices are going to change and how much each area is going to be affected by the national stats that we're hearing predicted. And you just have to be confident that your area you're safe in what you're doing because you're building yourself in enough contingency. So on price, definitely we've built in a contingency. And then the product that we're creating, we have been really careful to choose something that will hit a slightly different target. So before I've bought flips for families. And this is more for like semi-retiring downsizers who are wanting to get rid of the bigger mortgages or the bigger costs or the bigger energy for, houses and just downsize a little bit. So it's a slightly different market because I think that it will hit that segment really well, but also it could be a backup for families who are also downsizing. So we've kind of extended our reach in that respect. And also we've got more exits than before. So this particular deal could work really well as a flip. It could work really well as a holiday let because of its location, which isn't something that I particularly enjoy. I've done it before once intentionally and once as a backup when a corporate let fell through, but I don't enjoy it. But I could do that as an option on this property, or it could be our home if really we needed it to be, or it could be a rental. So we've got more exits on the deal. And I think those three things, bigger buffers, one of them being from your asking price, more potential target audience, and more potential exits are just absolutely key. Because you can buy anything as long as you're protected enough and you feel confident in the risks that you're taking.
Absolutely. I think you've just shared some great advice, and actually I advocate all of that. I think really you were talking about mitigating risk and actually having a plan A and a plan B and a plan C and D at the minute, which I think is just really smart, and not just in the world of flipping properties. I actually think when it comes to some other deals that we're looking at as well. And I don't know what you think about this, but I think it's really hard. You have to be quite disciplined to approach your deals like that, right? I think you have to be prepared to walk away from a deal to get a good deal to buy it. You obviously went to the auction, and why didn't you buy it in the room, Jess? There must have been some discipline there. There must have been something you thought, at this level it works. How did that come about? Because I think that is tough to do. It's so easy to get carried away. It's so easy to get emotionally involved in deals. And the same at the other side when you're running away with the idea of creating. You talked about creating a really well positioned product for that market, but it's easy, and I've done this myself, to overspend. It's easy to underspend as well. So this discipline, and maybe specifically if you could tell us how you kind of managed to get this one at auction.
Yeah, I use we a lot. This one actually, when usually it's me, but this actually is we. I bought this with my other half in his name for tax reasons. So when it comes to things like this, I'm the fun sponge in the relationship. So my top line of where we would stop bidding was lower than Chris's. Well, we hit our top number, and Chris was like, oh, come on, just again. I was like, we're not doing it, shut up. So yeah, we had that, but we did end up bidding, I don't know, a few grand, 4 grand, 5, 6, maybe over our top number. And it went beyond that. And so we tapped out. I think it was 6 grand over our top number. And it went beyond a few £1,000s. So we just stopped. But it didn't, when he just said, last call, he couldn't sell because it hadn't met the reserve. And so immediately their sales teams were on the phone to all the highest bidders and emailing us. And within 24 hours, they'd accepted our offer. And so either ours still wasn't the highest. We'd seen bidding go higher in the room the day before, online it was. So either the other buyers had tapped out or bought other lots, or they just decided they didn't want it anymore. Maybe ours did end up being the highest when it was still, when everything had cooled down the next day. But we secured it the next day, and we said to them, our offer isn't the highest offer that we saw yesterday, but last time we bought an auction, we completed within 9 days. So if that's appealing to you, that's where we stand. And we owned it, I think, 14 days later.
Wow, that's incredibly fast. Well, I think hats off to you, Jess, because that sort of discipline, I think, is difficult to put into practice when you're buying property, especially when you've invested the time and the resources and probably some money getting things like legal packs reviewed. And I think that's a really good point, and I hope that our listeners today do take that away, because I think applying that discipline across everything you do in property, more so now than ever, because margins are tighter and the risks are a little bit higher with things as they are, is incredibly important.
It is important. If I can add, I operate by myself in my property business, but I do, as we all need, to have a really kind of tight network. And I still have my original property mentor as a friend and mentor. And the thing that I need from him particularly is a nudge to be less rigid sometimes, because I am a very analytical person and I am quite disciplined in that respect. But actually the deal that we're going to be talking about a little bit today is an example of me actually pushing myself into going, I know enough, I trust enough, I have to jump now, because I can be a little bit overcautious and I have to be nudged. And I think over time I'll obviously mess it up sometimes, but at the moment, hopefully the calls about when to jump and when to not are okay at the moment. They're paying off at the moment.
It certainly seems the case, and you are right, Jess. There is a point at which there is no guarantee, and there is a little bit of a leap of faith, and all your research and all that stuff has got to be put into play. And also, look, if we could find a way of picking ourselves out of any deal, if we could find reasons not to do it, the price isn't right, the planning isn't right, the seller isn't right, whatever it might be. And I think you have got to be prepared to take some risks as well. And I think the reality is there's a good balance, isn't there? There's a good balance of being disciplined with your numbers and the way that you approach deals and how you negotiate, but also having that faith in what you're doing, more broadly speaking, and the fact that, look, if it didn't quite go to plan, the worst case would still be okay. You could still soldier on through. Yeah. It wouldn't hurt you too much. And I think that is a really good attitude to have in property. And I certainly try and adopt that attitude. And even with the bigger deals, I think it, which interestingly feels even more so like you have to take that position. The banks are incredibly picky when you're getting into the larger developments, as I'm sure you know. So it's interesting to hear you talk about this. Let's jump over to the HMOs then. This project that you bought in the West Midlands, the numbers are really fantastic. The deal is a beautiful project. And interestingly, I recorded something recently to help try and reset the expectations of our listeners and our community members who are finding it tougher to stack deals up at the minute. And I think as we walk through this deal, we'll see a good example and evidence that actually you still can achieve those well above average numbers. And I think that you've done that here. But before we get into the details of that, just talk us, if you would, Jess, through a little bit of why you actually decided to invest in HMOs. And you talked a lot in your case study about the product and that kind of mission behind what you're actually trying to do, which I thought was interesting to see, particularly when you look at it against the results that you've got, and that it's definitely not an accident that it's washed out this way. So could you tell us a little bit about that before we get into the nitty-gritty of the deal?
Yeah, sure. I mean, fundamentally, I'm in property to make money. That's what I've chosen as my income and my profession. So that's why I'm there. But I quite simply, I believe that everybody deserves to live in a home that helps them to flourish. That is what I believe everybody has a fundamental right to do, whether they are in a social housing house or a beautiful high-end flip. I believe everybody should feel, I deserve this, I'm worth it, when they are at home. And I want to create that for people. And that's what drives me. And it didn't start off like that. I started off just on a very practical and financial level, thinking, okay, this is my way out of my job. And it was probably during lockdown and, thinking about, why am I doing this? Where's this going? What do I want from it? And chatting to other people, that I realized how strongly I felt about your home being your sanctuary and that being really important. And so that really drives decisions that I make in properties that I develop. Very much so.
Well, unquestionably, it comes through in the work that you've done. They really just look absolutely incredible. So let's talk about these numbers then, Jess. So I'm going to just throw some of the headlines up. You purchased this for just under 200. You spent quite a lot of money on it. Your refurb was over 160, about 165,000. So
yeah, it was about that. Yeah,
all costs on refurb and all sort of fees then. So big refurb, and I think you were all in for about £380,000. So it'd be quite big numbers actually we're talking about, and a lot of that is in the refurb. The revaluation was 550,000. What that means is you've obviously done very well and made a really good capital gain on it. Well done you. And I like that. But the bit that I really like is how well you're doing at the back end of this, which, considering you outsource the management, you are still sort of netting about £250 per room, which I think, and I did a podcast on this recently, I think that is just phenomenal, because the reality is interest rates have really kind of clobbered our deals, and I think there's a bit of a lag. We've got to wait for rents to come up a little bit and hopefully interest rates to go down to get back to where we used to be. But this is a great example that actually you can still get pretty close to those numbers that we have been getting for a while. And I think that's incredible. But what I'm really interested to know here, Jess, is how you made all of this happen, because you talked in your case study, we had a bit of a chat before we hit record, about the process you went through of acquiring this property and then actually getting it to what was ultimately this 7-bed, all singing and all dancing HMO. So can you talk us through this? Because I know it wasn't completely plain sailing, was it?
No, it wasn't. I don't know whose great deals are ever anymore, but anymore. Sound like a
none of mine apparently anymore, Jess. I mean, every deal I seem to be rescuing from, it's on life support until the last minute.
Yeah, there's always a headache, but that's why it's worth it, I suppose. But no, this one. So when I bought this property, there was a bit of competition for it, but as naturally there is. But I think quite a lot of people were put off by the fact that there was visibly a lot of structural damage. There was some old bomb shaking from, World War II in the property. And I think luckily for me, that put quite a lot of people off. It wasn't possible to see what the extent of that damage was, obviously, until rip out. But yeah, that was visible. But then in deciding whether or not to actually purchase the property, firstly, there was the financial modelling to do on what we would achieve and what was good enough and what was, our ultimate goal. So there's quite a lot of financial modelling to do. But then also there were houses in a conservation area and also planning. My objective with the property was to turn it into a 7-bedroom property from the existing 3-bedroom setup, and there had been several declined planning applications for 8-bed HMOs on the street in the previous couple of years, with citing overburdening of infrastructure and those kinds of things as the reasoning behind that. But there were 2 more accepted planning applications on the neighbouring streets than there were declined on this street. And so I thought, okay, it was worth a punt. And I say punt casually. It was a very, very considered, calculated decision informed by lots of consultancy and structural surveys and things. But so we decided it was worth it from a planning perspective. We didn't get our first option accepted, but we, with some alterations and working with the planning consultant architect, we did end up getting our 7 bedrooms approved. So that's where we got to. The structural damage turned out to have quite a significant impact. So when we ripped out, I'd added in, when I calculate numbers, everyone puts in a contingency. I had added in a second contingency purely for the unknowns around the structural damage. And when we ripped out, we noticed that most of the first floor walls were not connected to the party walls. They were just sort of free floating, and the floors were all collapsing. So we rebuilt the entire first floor floors and walls, which was an unexpected £9,500, but we had a contingency for it. So yeah, the structural side of things was manageable. It was more the planning and the finance modelling, because we didn't initially know where we were going to end up. So like you said before, when the outcome of your HMO is so unknown at the moment that you have to be confident that every scenario is okay enough to do it. It was.
I think that's such an intelligent approach to doing something like this that has so many unknowns. And kudos to you, because these sorts of projects, you need quite a thick skin to take on these sorts of projects with these sorts of unsureties around them. You said that you didn't, on the first approach, or your first thoughts, didn't get the planning that you wanted. What had you originally wanted? Can you give us a little bit more detail about that? And we talked again before we hit record about a couple of unusual things that the council came back and said, which I think are worth highlighting, because councils can be difficult, and I think this is a good example.
Yeah, it was really frustrating at the time. It's actually turned out for the best, and I'll explain that too. But in order to get 7 bedrooms out of this house, so the house I mentioned before was set up as a 3-bedroom house. It was actually being run as a 5-bedroom HMO, but it was being run illegally, unlicensed, non-compliantly, completely unsafely. So although it looked to the untrained eye as a 5-bedroom HMO, it was a 3-bedroom house. And we wanted to take it straight to a 7-bed. We didn't want to do phase planning of C3 to C4 and then extend it into sui generis. We wanted to go straight for 7. We felt confident enough from the applications that we'd seen that had been successful that we would be able to do that. But the approach that we used was to include a box dormer. It's a large 3-bedroom Victorian terrace with a large outrigger. And we wanted to use a loft extension to create 2 bedrooms in the loft. And that was in the initial plans, which were rejected. Well, yeah, we were told if we submitted them, it would be a definite rejection on 2 grounds. One of them was we wouldn't be allowed to use a box dormer. That wasn't possible because of the conservation area.
But they already existed on the street. There were other examples of these on the street.
Absolutely. Yeah. When we put in the application, we evidenced aerial photography of other box dormers, probably about 10 doors down, 2 of them on the same street. Yeah. Which had been built since the conservation area existed. So yeah, that was very frustrating. That was one reason. And then the other reason was in having a loft conversion with 2 bedrooms in it, one of the bedrooms would only have Velux windows. It wouldn't have a dormer. And that was going to be declined on the basis that the person who lived in that room wouldn't have an outlook. To which we responded that I own them. There are hundreds of 2 to 5 bed conversions in this area which have loft rooms which only have Velux windows, and they're done under permitted development and they're completely compliant and the council's happy with those. So our argument was, how can you decline something under planning that is completely permissible and doable under PD? It doesn't make sense. And their argument was that under a mental health policy, it wasn't good for tenants and they wouldn't authorise it. So we had to make sure that any room had an outlook directly onto a garden. So we changed the plans and we made sure that the loft had 1 bedroom in it, a massive studio, and then downstairs we put in a single story ground floor extension. And I think that actually it was annoying. It probably added 10 grand to the cost, and there's loads of space in the loft which we can't use, which is always really annoying, just wasted floor space. But actually the size of the bedrooms meant that they're all studios. They're all really desirable. It means that every room is at the top end of the offering in the area. And I think those reasons are why we get the really high rents that we do, and probably one of the reasons why we got one of the best like one of the best GDVs in the area for a 7-bed. When I was doing my research in preparation for my refinance, all of my local peers, we achieved a number that they weren't getting, and so actually it was really annoying to not get our box dormer and to have to build an extra extension. But I think it paid off. It worked out well.
Obviously, very pleased for you that it did. But I think we would like to think that the council, they have mandates, they have policies, local and national frameworks that they should work towards. And yet there is often this illogical and impractical approach to granting planning permissions. And Johnny Stockwell, he's one of my mentees, he came back on the show recently and did a second episode with us. And we talked a lot about the real challenges that Johnny has faced in Liverpool with the council there and planning. And they recently introduced an Article 4 and have been trying to put all sorts of obstacles, anything that they can think about, to try and leverage in any way to prevent applications or delay applications, just to make it incredibly difficult for HMO investors. They really don't like the student or studentification of this particular area. Now, there were some extreme examples in Johnny's case, but similarly here, suggestions like you can't have Velux windows because the outlook is, because tenants should have an outlook. It just goes against, pretty much everything that planning is meant to do, which is maximise good use of space and promote all sorts of things. And, when there are examples and precedents have been set, certainly with at least Veluxes, but even dormers, I think it really just highlights how careful as investors we have to be, because we would love to think that this is actually pretty obvious. Who's going to have an issue with a Velux? Who's going to have an issue with a dormer? Every other one on the street has got one. I've been there before. I had real issues with councils on that. And I think while a lot of it should be simpler, it often isn't. And I'd like to know how you managed to make those decisions. I know you sort of worked with a few sort of professionals to do this, didn't you, Jess? Can you tell us a little bit about that and kind of how important that was? Are these decisions that were obvious, or really were you in part quite reliant on having these sort of experts working with you?
So I worked with my architect, who can support planning applications and is an HMO specialist, but I also work with a planning consultant on this. My architect and I decided that together, that it would be best to work with a planning consultant on this one because we knew it would be particularly contentious. And I didn't have a planning consultant before, so I worked with one who had a successful planning application for, I can't remember if it was a 7 or an 8-bed HMO, 4 streets away maybe, in the last 6 months, with a friend of mine. So I had a personal recommendation to him, and I'd seen that his work was successful. So we worked as a trio, and we had quite a few calls together where we were, assessing feedback, looking at evidence, deciding which route to go. And their job is to present the pro and con, or the risks of each scenario. And I just thought, let's just do it, just knowing what the worst can happen. Just partly it was analysing that information, and partly it was I just sort of felt like it would be okay. I don't know how, I just felt like it would be okay. I think it's because I was confident enough in the fallback option that it was okay to go for the bigger option straight away. But yeah, we did have many calls and hundreds of emails between us all deciding how best to approach it before we then made the call on what best to do.
I think circling back to what we originally talked about today, that all those methods of reducing the risk, it's another really great example of just finding ways to do that, just kind of chipping away at that risk, bringing in your experts. I think planning consultants that often bring something slightly different to architects. Often just the approach to dealing with councils and knowing when to pull back a bit, when to push a little bit, when to really kind of highlight their own policies and things like that. So again, really interesting to hear you talk about this stuff, Jess, because I think there are a lot of people in our community out there doing these sorts of projects, proposing these sorts of schemes. And I think we've just got to be careful that we don't bite off more than we can chew. It's often harder to sort of wriggle out of these or eventually find a way if we don't sort of go into it in the right position or with the right plan in the first instance. So hearing you talk about, even with your experience, some of the strategies that you adopted to help sort of eventually get this where you needed and get a great result at the end, which as we've talked about, is I think a real takeaway for a lot of people today.
I think your point, what you just said about the role of the planner, that really was why this planner was there. My architect could have done it, but it was his soft skills in knowing what to say His
Yeah.
experience in knowing what wording to use, that was the skill, not in the learning the policy or looking for the loopholes. It was the
Yeah.
soft skills. That's why he earned his fee for that project
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah. I think I use a planning consultant on pretty much everything, and I think it's just having that really kind of experience touch, just knowing how to manage those sorts of people, other end of those emails, and yeah, it's great to hear that it all worked for you in the end. But again, just for our listeners, Jess's case study is inside the HMO roadmap, so go and check it out because it really is a wonderful example of how to do it and how to get fantastic results. Jess, I'm conscious of time, but I've got a couple of really sort of quick fire questions that I would love to ask you, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear the answers too. So, first one, quick one. Biggest challenges today, or biggest challenge to date investing in property? Is there a standout for you? I'm putting you on the spot, but...
Actually, my second ever HMO purchase was a really complicated buy for some reason. Actually, it was because, I'll try and answer it quickly, but basically the property was sourced to me. So I bought a source deal and it was being sold by a brother and sister. It was their parents' house. They had been through probate. They were selling it. They didn't know how to do the process of selling a house. And I had some poor advice along the way in terms of lending. And then after eventually going through this process, so I was recommended a certain type of product by a broker that I don't work with anymore. It was wrong. They wanted certain things putting in place, so I had to agree. Exchange with delayed completion, which was really hard when the sellers didn't even know how to do that. And then at the very last minute, the funding was pulled anyway. And I had something like 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks to complete the deal, I think. And I think that because the funding had pulled, I was about 100 grand short, which at that point in my investing career was massive because my investors weren't investing that type of money with me then. They were like 10, 20, 30K investors then. So I was really nervous at that point, but it took a year and a day from accepting the offer to completing on the purchase. So that was probably the biggest one.
Well, I like to ask this question occasionally because I'm always conscious that we shouldn't make the podcast sound like a highlights reel. It's great to talk about the highlights, but I think it's also really important just to remind ourselves and everyone listening that, most of the time, often things don't go to plan, and hearing people like you, Jess, who are doing great things, but have had to deal with very difficult things.
We've just had a horrible situation where we've had to evict someone that went to court. He owes us thousands of pounds, but he was a real bully, and we've been sent audios that are voicemails that he's sent to other tenants, and the cleaner said he used to follow her around the house smoking and leering, and we didn't know that until after he'd gone. And just horrible people. But yeah, you get all sorts.
It's strangely reassuring to hear from people who have done incredibly successful things or talk about the challenges that they've had, and I'm sure you're the same, Jess, but even now, sort of 15, 16, 17 years into my investing journey, I still find some strange reassurance in hearing that other people are dealing with, have had to deal with lots of issues on their way. I've got one more question that I'd love to ask you, and again, I'm going to put you on the spot, but I think we can keep this one quick. If there was one piece of advice, Jess, I guess looking at all your experience, and you're a woman in property, and you've got a young child, and you're very busy, one piece of advice that you would share with an investor who's maybe those few years behind, just sort of maybe getting started, approaching their first deal, is there one piece of advice that you would give them to help them on their way?
Learn how to make decisions quickly and with confidence, and then when you've made it, move on.
That is actually, I did a talk at the HMO Awards last year, and I think there was 10 points, and it was about successful traits I'd seen in investors who built quite large portfolios. And one of the things I said in that was they are able to make decisions quickly and confidently. So nice to also hear you say something similar. Jess, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. We should have done this much sooner, but maybe we can put a little place marker in for some time next year. Thank you for sharing your journey. Thank you for sharing this fantastic case study. And thank you for coming on the show to chat about all of this with me today.
Thank you so much. I look forward to coming back one day, but thank you for having me today. I've loved speaking with you.